Welcome everybody to Epic. This is our special podcast for our Multiplying Discipleship series, and we're so thankful that you're here to join us for this evening as we discuss mental health among Asian Americans. We titled this "What You Don't Know Can Kill You," and so this is something that we're engaging with on a real level, especially during a pandemic. And so we recognize that this topic is something that is probably near and dear to our hearts, and yet also really far from us, because it might be something we aren't normally willing to talk about or able to have the vocabulary to talk about. My name is Tony Wee. I introduce myself. I'm the National Director of Strategic Partnering for the EPIC movement. And we have some very special guests with us to discuss this very important topic, especially for us in the Asian American world. So let me start with our first guest is Dr. Pongfo Rhodes. She is currently living in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist with her PhD. She works primarily with Hmong and other Asian American couples and families. She lives with her husband, Greg, and they planted a church recently focusing on second and third generation Hmong. So welcome to the broadcast. I'd also love to introduce our national director, Margaret Yu. Many of you know her already, and she probably needs no introduction, but she has been on staff with us for over 35 years, a wealth of experience serving on multiple capacities in the Midwest as well as the West Coast. She now resides in Southern California, and she is also has been our executive director for, I guess it's been 3-4 years now. 5 years. Okay. She's been a mainstay with us for so long. She's like an institution. So it's just so much fun to have her on these broadcasts, and welcome Margaret into the fold too. We also have Hung Lu with us as well. He is our leader of EPIC at Case Western in Cleveland, Ohio. So shout out to Case Western for all of you Case fans. Also shout out to any of us who are of the Ohio persuasion. We have a shortened season for the Big Ten this year, but that's something that Hung and I have always enjoyed as we go to almost all of our EPIC conferences. I think we find some way to watch Ohio State, right?
Very much so.
All of our fall retreats, we find a way. That's a common goal that we have. Maybe that's part of our mental health issue as well. I don't know. Yet here we are. So Hung, welcome to the broadcast as well. Let's jump right in, because this is a very thorough and heavy topic that has a litany of tons of questions we can get to, and I hope we can get to some of your questions as well. But we have some that we'll engage with in conversation here. But let's ask this first question, and it's a little pithy, but first question I'll ask you, for you, Dr. Pongfo, is first of all, how can not knowing things kill us?
Yeah, great question. Suicide is actually the second leading cause of death among young people 15 to 24 years old. Yeah. So that means that it is a big issue. The other thing about not knowing is that because we are holistic people, if our mental health isn't strong, or we're not doing well in that area, our psychological, our spiritual, our physical, and our relationships suffer. So a lot of the research shows that when somebody has a mental health issue, it usually translates into their body not functioning well. And so a lot of people struggle with their physical health, when really we also need to take care of the emotional health.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that there's this interconnection. Margaret, the same question for you. I mean, I'll credit you for actually coming up with our title. What gave you the impetus for not knowing, and how can that hurt us?
I keep on thinking about just stories of people that I've known, whether people I disciple or mentor or friends at church, who, on a daily basis, you go, oh, they seem to be doing well spiritually, and they seem to be like such charmers. They're just great people. And then you find out all of a sudden that, well, they committed suicide, or they're trying to commit suicide, or they're really depressed, but no one knew about it. And a lot of times, the saddest stories for me is that afterwards, people go, we didn't know. Mm-hmm. We didn't know that this was such a big issue. And we wish we had known. We wish we had talked about it. Mm-hmm. And so that's really why this conversation is important for us. Just like what Dr. Pongfo was saying, the statistics are staggering. This is a major issue for Asian American community as well. So,
yeah. It's something that even in my household, I know it was very taboo in general to be able to talk about. But as we think about this, even as we minister to Asian American college students, first, let me ask you a question, Hung. What have you experienced as you've been in the field at Case Western or any other college campuses? How have Asian American college students dealt with mental health in a pandemic now? Before the pandemic, first of all, but also as we're dealing with it in a pandemic now. How have you seen Asian American college students deal with that?
For me, over the last few years, mental health has come up more in conversation. And I think just even seeing students even talk about it very quietly in our times together. One example I can give, just in the last few years, I can count on my hands probably 5 different occasions where students were depressed or thinking about suicide because of the pressures. And I think even during the pandemic is even higher because not being in community or being in person and just being on a screen has increased that even more.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Pongfo, do you have comments about that as well?
Yeah, certainly across the board, young people and older people, but the idea that during these challenging COVID times, that anybody who had depression before, it's intensified.
Yes.
People who had anxiety before, it's now intensified.
Yes.
Those who didn't have it before now are experiencing anxiety and depression. So just the number of people experiencing mental health issues has gone up. We don't have exact numbers right now because we're still in the middle of it. But anecdotally, we can say that there is an increase. And just being home, I mean, for college students who are never sure if they're going to be on campus, have to go home, whatever the case, just the uncertainty adds a lot of stress to their everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're already beginning with a generation. We've seen some research on Gen Z that this is the most stressed out, suicidal, insecure, and tired generation in modern American history, where we're even sensing, I think there was someone who had mentioned how, Pearl Harbor just took like a year to get over. But since the past 6 months have occurred, even before the pandemic, we've had, I think, up to 6 Pearl Harbor level events that have gone on in our world today because we're exposed to so much media, exposed to so much in our news cycle and social media as well. So it's a lot to take in for an individual. What do you guys see as some of the issues that have been too shameful or taboo to talk about for Asian American college students?
I think a lot of times when we hear their stories, like we go on summer missions and we build community. And a lot of times I'll hear this at the end of the summer missions, they'll say, wow, I've never told anyone some of the things that I've told this community. Things like I struggle with my sexual identity. Things like, my grades were really bad, or the person that I dated, I never told my parents. There's so many things that are taboo, or I struggle with depression, I struggle with cutting. So many things that they would say that in the context of community, they felt safe to share, but other times they would never talk about it, and especially in terms of their own anxiety or depression.
And I think even to echo what Margaret said, and me working with college students, is a lot of those things that Margaret shared, but even in a sense, sometimes they would only share with me because they're afraid to talk about with other people because the fear of what people will think and what they have experienced growing up. And so,
And I also see that addictions are on the rise, whether it's anything from chemical dependency to porn addictions to just even gaming, to the point where it disrupts the everyday life functioning. And I think particularly in Christian communities, it's hard to talk about our sins. It has to do with something that I know I'm not supposed to do, but I'm stuck in that cycle of addiction. So that just adds to the layer of the mental health that I can't even talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, those are very real things that I think that if we actually brought to the light, there might be something about that could actually be healing, and there could actually be a process of healing. But wow, it has been so hard to even broach those topics. And now you add on COVID-19 into this space as we're talking about this. Dr. Pongfo, how have you seen Asian Americans coping during COVID-19, especially as it relates to even racial injustices? And you obviously live in a city that has been the center of attention for, obviously it's been for African Americans, but especially of the Hmong community. Can you share about just what you're seeing, how Asian Americans have been coping through this?
Yeah, so early on with the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic, there was definitely fear of the backlash against using words such as the calling coronavirus the Chinese virus or Asian virus, so that anyone who was Asian would feel the fear that they would be targeted. So that was kind of the start, right, in May and June. And then with the racial injustices and social unrest, particularly as it unfolded here in the Twin Cities with the death of George Floyd, the Hmong community was scared because one of the officers is Hmong. One of the officers is married to a Hmong person. So the Hmong community had this dilemma of, who do we identify with? Should we, march with those for Black Lives Matter? Or should we distance ourselves from that and say, kind of try to absolve ourselves of any wrongdoing? And the community itself was split. It brought up issues of our own historical trauma, where as recent immigrants, we faced lots of discrimination. And at the lowest social order, there was a lot of, fighting for physical territory, but also for financial support. And so African Americans often were perpetrators of racism against Hmong people. So then we had that on top of everything that was happening around us. And the community really, it was hard to have conversations because people's anxieties were up, people's fear and anger, and then re-traumatization of, wait a minute, we're also the victims. How did we all of a sudden now become the bad people, the perpetrators? So there's just a lot of chaos. Again, just adding to the amount of mental health issues that are happening all around us. And when we talk about mental health, then it's hard to admit these things. I mean, I've heard young people say, I don't want to say anything because I might be talking to somebody who is totally against Black Lives Matters. Or I might be talking to somebody who is shaming me because I'm not as involved as they think I should be. Again, just this more dis-ease than ever before.
Yeah, you talk about just when I hear what you're saying, I hear the word conflict, just internal conflict, that there's so much tension of being able to say, like, which side am I a part of? Can I be on either one of these sides? Can I actually choose a side? Is there a space for that? And it just leads to its own set of trauma. It sounds like it's its own level of that. And the follow-up question to this too is, can you help us define, Dr. Pongfo, what is racial trauma? And how does that play into the trauma that Asian Americans at large experience, especially in light of COVID-19?
Sure. So racial trauma is any race-based traumatic stress that a person experiences, mental and emotional. And it usually is caused by encounters with racial bias or discrimination, hate crimes, but that experiencing of it and being exposed to it firsthand. And what it results in then is the person feeling humiliated, scared, wanting to separate and protect themselves. But ultimately, at the deep psychic level, is this identity crisis that happens where there's a dramatic loss of your own identity and your meaning within the social fabric of your larger community. It attacks your sense of self and personhood. So again, going back to the idea of should I be pro this or against it, that has to do with issues of who am I?
Mm-hmm.
And will people judge me if I take one stance or the other? So the deepest injury that comes from racial trauma is at the deepest level of your identity, but is also on a practical daily basis of how should I be when I'm out there in the world?
Mm-hmm.
Should I be paranoid, defensive, fearful, or should I act bigger than I really am because I don't want to get taken advantage of?
Right.
So it's at every level.
Yeah. Well, you can definitely see people, especially Asian Americans, I notice it on an anecdotal level, that they end up trying to be as polarized as possible so they can just feel like they belong into one of those sides in one way or the other. I've seen it on both ends of the spectrum on so many levels. Even before COVID-19, how would you see, historical trauma or racial trauma, how those have affected Asian Americans specifically?
Yeah. So, I mean, we as Asian Americans have a history here in the United States of being seen as the exotic other. You could be your fifth generation, fourth generation here, and people will still see you as the perpetual foreigner. So that, again, has some racial trauma that we incur. But historical trauma also goes way back to our parents, our grandparents, even some of us who immigrated here, that the historical trauma has happened over centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So not just the last couple decades, but centuries of migration or oppression. Pretty much every Asian American group in their native country has experienced some form of oppression. So the idea of historical trauma, that our parents and our grandparents, what they experienced, gets passed down to us through the ways that they have adapted to survival.
Mm-hmm.
So here's an example in the Hmong community. Because we don't have a national country that we can say, this is our country, our land, and we were constantly migrating from literally country to country, this sense of never knowing what tomorrow will be like. So,
yeah.
so this dis-ease with the future and with uncertainty.
Right.
So our parents prefer that we pick, jobs and choices that are really solid and that will produce something right now.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of waiting for the future is really hard, but that's part of the historical trauma, that they learn to survive by eating what we have today, slash and burn, because that's how we are going to survive today. And that has seeped into our psyche of how we see tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We'll definitely see that as we're looking at migration story is a big deal. We talked about that last month, actually, when we talked about Asian American history, and wow, how that affects us so much. Margaret, did you want to add more into that too?
Yeah, when I was listening to Dr. Pongfo, I was thinking of, for myself as an immigrant child, just how so much of my parents' mentality of survival has impacted me,
right,
and even caused a lot of fear. As a survivor, you're fearful of the outside world. You're trying to fit in. And so my parents are always fearful. And so I think for most of my childhood, I was a worrywart. I worry about a lot of things. And so I really kind of resonated with what you were saying, how that was passed on to me inadvertently.
Yeah, and so if we have what we call uncertainty avoidance, if that's really high, imagine what it's like now when pretty much everything is uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
Like our health is uncertain. You might catch COVID if you leave the house.
Right.
You might not have a job tomorrow. And so talk about uncertainty at its all-time high.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really learned how to deal with uncertainty.
And I mean, I just think about that in relationship to what is faith then for the Asian American, that just colors how we understand what does it mean to take a step of faith with the Lord, when actually it's this mental, emotional struggle of just dealing with uncertainty based on that kind of history and trauma. Then, that affects a lot of, I think, what churches decide, maybe how we run our ministries. Even, I mean, I definitely see it in Epic too, that we still struggle with this survivor's mentality of, actually, I think we're not certain about what's going to happen, so let's just do our own thing, right? And is that really what God is that a God honoring faith and such?
Right.
So,
And we have a lot of faith, yes, but.
Yeah, right.
The but is the part that our parents taught us to just put your head down and work hard, and who knows if we'll survive tomorrow, but at least today we did our part.
So true.
Yeah. And I mean, again, without editorializing, I mean, it just reflects even why it's so important to understand our sociology and our history, as well as now how it affects our mental, emotional capacities when we do discipleship or when we're engaging in conversations with students, because it affects us in ways that we can't even imagine. So, I mean, there is a statistic that's out there from the National Institute of Mental Health that says that Asian Americans are significantly less likely to seek out mental health services. I think they said around 20% of Asian Americans will seek out mental health versus, say, a typical white person will seek it out at 45%. And that's a 20% swing right there, 25% swing. How do we help lower that kind of a barrier with our young people, with the people that we interact with? I mean, like, what do you do when you have a friend who is struggling with mental health issues? How do we engage that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we have to do is to reduce the stigma of mental health, and then secondly, mental health services. And so reducing the stigma of mental health, what I have found helpful with young people is to actually do a family history. Like I will say, for me to really get to know you, I want to know your family history. And oftentimes in the family history, I will say, wow, that was a lot of trauma that your parents experienced. And sometimes for the student, it's the first time they've reframed it that way, that, oh, that is trauma. So that they can understand that, whoa, my parents went through trauma. Certainly that's going to affect me somehow. So reducing the stigma by just labeling it, to just say, well, that sounded like your father was really depressed for the first 5 years that you were here in America because he had lost everything. And to even say that that's normal and it's part of what has been happening. So even the way that we use the language, if anxiety and depression and mental health become words that we're comfortable with, and we don't have any facial reaction to it, we just talk about it like anything normal that we would talk about, I think that will help to reduce that stigma. It's the first small step. The second one, I think, is for us to help reframe mental health, knowing that we come from honor shame culture, to be able to redeem mental health so that it is actually for honor instead of for shame. So when I work with couples, this is what I usually say to them. It is better that you get help now than later when your marriage breaks up and you have pain. And then I will tell parents, it's better that your child gets mental health now than later when he or she commits suicide, or the whole community finds out what they did, and then you will have shame. But how honorable it is right now for you to support your spouse or your child. So again, just reframing from our Eastern lens that there can be honor in dealing with mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. That's reframing it is a big deal. Hung, how have you been able to do this with your students?
Yeah, I think for me is listening. I think listening, asking questions, just kind of seeing where they're coming from, and even how they arrived, at even how they look at mental health. And something I try to do is being empathetic to even where they're at. But even in a sense, it's not sugarcoating it or not even saying what I've always heard is have more faith with your mental health. It's like, just have more faith. It'll go away. But trying to empathize with them, even journey with them the best way that I can until there's a point where I can't. But I may even encourage them, like, this is above me. Maybe this would be helpful for you to talk with someone, like a counselor or somebody. But even if they're afraid, putting myself out there, it's like, I'll go with you, has been what I've seen as I encourage students on campus.
Yeah. What have you done anything specifically with mental health, Hung, that's been really encouraging for how to encourage your students to enter into that?
I think what Dr. Rhodes has said is kind of normalizing the conversation. And I think just even seeing when students are anxious, or as I see their behavior change, is asking more questions and trying to care for them, and just making observations. I think one student, and this is not at Case, but actually at Cleveland State, where I encourage and kind of walk through as they're going through a season of depression. They called it depression, but just helping to walk with them, and even sending them to a place that our church is partnering with, and drove them there a few times, and just sat in the parking lot waiting for them to be done and to drive them back, and just a journey with them. So those are some things I've done on campus. Yeah.
Well, I like what you guys are saying in terms of even just being able to use the vocabulary of mental health, or even saying depression, or being able to say those things, that it's not a stigma, but that there's something cathartic, right, about just being able to say what it really is and just calling it out for what it is, and that it's normal. It's not this like, oh my gosh, you are totally mental now, or anything like that. It's just being able to say, having to really talk about the issues that are at hand is normal, and it's healthy. It's more God honoring in a lot of ways.
Yes, and for a lot of people struggling with mental health, there's a loss of hope. Like just feeling like this is all I'm going to experience for the rest of my life, or there is no way out. And if we can normalize the conversation about mental health, we would also be able to steer people to the fact that anywhere from 80 to 90% of people with depression who get help actually find it helpful. And whether it is that they learn how to cope and then they learn how to live with it, or that they eventually will come out of the depression. But either way, 80 to 90% research is showing that therapy is effective for people with depression.
Absolutely. Well, for many of us, we're engaging in spaces, especially among Asian American college students, as staff members or as fellow student leaders. It's almost impossible to actually try to diagnose somebody, or to try to actually help somebody really get through the full battle of mental health in a lot of ways, perhaps. But what role, as people who are disciplers, disciple makers, as we're talking about multiplying disciples, multiplying holistic disciples, what role can discipleship play in mental health? Margaret, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and this goes back to what you guys were talking about, what Hung and Dr. Pongfo was talking about in terms of the normalizing. I think a lot of us grew up in homes where emotions and feelings are not encouraged, or expressions of those are encouraged. For myself, I was taught, like, you don't feel, if you're gonna cry. I cried in the bathroom by myself. And so just even as we think about ourselves, as we mentor people and disciple people, I think we're the role models. It's kind of like you see people who normalize that. Yeah, you know what? I do have some anxiety, and so I'm getting help. Or, starting with myself, I've been to counseling, and it's really helped me. I think there's something about that relationally that helps our students when we're honest about our own emotional well-being. And we normalize it. We talk about emotions and feelings. I think about discipleship. In Epic Movement, we have a values of leadership, reproduction, and what kind of environment is really helpful. We call it the 9 elements. You can look it up. The 9 elements, one of them is actually emotional maturity and holistic transformation. What we're saying is that when Jesus gives the great commandment, he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second one is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. What he's saying is that it's really important for us to love God and to love ourselves and to love others. But did you notice the way of doing that is with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength in your body? And so there's a sense of holisticness about how we even love God. Mm-hmm. And so as we mentor people, as I mentor people, I make them think about emotions. In Epic, if you ever go to Epic events sometimes or summer missions, we actually teach our students emotions so that we can steward it. So that the emotions do not have power by themselves to isolate us from community and from God. That these emotions actually can be stewarded with God and in community, so that Jesus can help us heal. So that Jesus actually, have you ever noticed that sometimes people say, well, if you know the right belief, then you'll do the right thing. Doctrine is very important. Please know that. We believe in the Word of God. And it's really true. But a lot of times when you talk about people who struggle with doing the things that God wants them to do, a lot of times it's their emotions. Mm-hmm. And so as we teach people and get them comfortable about that, they're also emotional, that they're emotional beings. And how does Jesus play a role in healing them and even redeeming them and helping them grow? That's emotional maturity and holistic transformation. And I think that has to be part of our discipleship. I actually encourage students that I disciple or staff to read a psalm a day sometimes. Because in the Psalms, you'll read the writers talking about their emotions, like, oh Lord, like I'm so happy or I'm so depressed. But it's getting them to normalize that we have emotions as human beings. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes in our evangelicalism, there's a lot of this positivity and only positivity that can really be there. It's like you're not allowed to have anything that's pseudo-negative, but you always have to, because we believe in a big God. So therefore, everything kind of tacitly has to be like, well, no, God is sovereign and God is good all the time, right? That's kind of what we say. But then to actually say, no, I'm struggling and it's hurting, and to actually stay there the way that David did in some of these Psalms, yeah, it can feel really foreign in our culture, I would say. Yeah. Hung, how about for yourself too, as you're interacting with college students?
Yeah, and I think for me, echoing what Margaret said as well, something as like I'm helping the students I'm entrusted with to see that God cares about their emotional well-being. Mm-hmm. And just even our team as a whole has been talking a lot about not something very new, but it's been around, called spiritual formation. And Dallas Willard describes it this way. In the Christian tradition, it's a process of increasingly being possessed and permeated by character traits of Jesus as we walk the easy yoke of discipleship with Jesus, our teacher. And I think even for me, as I continue to introduce that to guys that I meet with, is helping them to see and even be more aware both of their emotions, that God values their emotions, and not just their spiritual, but not what they bring to the table, but their whole being. And this is something I've been trying to do with the guys I disciple at Case, because I think in Epic, what I've always enjoyed is the idea of story, even as I share some hard things in my life. My dad was a stuffer. My dad never showed his feelings. My mom is a very similar way. And I think as I continue to meet students and even my peers, is continuing to normalize the conversation with my disciples.
Yeah. I think that's a big word, is normalizing, right? And something that I know my professor, when I did spiritual formation at Talbot School of Theology, Institute of Spiritual Formation, plug. But they talked about emotions being they're terrible leaders, right? It's terrible to be led by your emotions, but they're excellent windows. Like they're indicators when God is doing something in your life. That it's sometimes it's so easy to just simply say, oh, there's an emotion that's negative. I'm not supposed to be angry at that person, so let me just stop, right? Whereas in discipleship, we can say, no, wait a minute. let's explore why you're angry. Let's talk about what God is doing in your anger, and to engage that a little bit differently. I think that's what an amazing discipler can do. But I think, Margaret, you alluded to a little bit about this, but to have emotional maturity is really that we need to be connected to ourselves in a really big way, right? To know like what's going on inside of us, to be aware of the emotions of what's going on inside of us, to be able to help someone else to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's where community is such a big part of that, and how God's people who are safe and healthy can really be mirrors for us in this journey. And what I love is, as you were talking about spiritual formation, Tony, I love what you were talking about, because it made me think about how in those moments, my emotions and my feelings are a window to my soul. And in that moment, I can choose to acknowledge what's in there. And I can choose to go to God. And then in that moment, I can choose to go, God, help me. Or it's confusing. And then I can also do that with friends who are mirrors and go, wow, that seems hard. And sometimes I don't even know. And then they listen to me share and they're like, wow, that's really hard. And I learn. It's almost like they're teaching me to go, oh yeah, that was hard. And somehow when we talk about what you don't know could kill you, is that emotions are strange. When you don't deal with them, they have a really nasty way of coming out in very inappropriate and hurtful ways. And so sometimes addiction, but just relationships, hurting people. We don't mean to, but when you don't deal with these emotions, they come back. You don't really stop them. They just come back uglier. You know what I mean? So, but I really love the idea of bringing Jesus into the emotions and sitting with him and having friends who are companions, spiritual companions. And then going, wow, this is deep rooted. If it's deep rooted, we go, wow, I think we might need some more help here. Sometimes the community is enough. Sometimes the Lord himself in spirit, but sometimes God uses other sources to help us go deeper into some of the wounds of these emotions.
Tony, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
The one more thing I wanted to add to even the discipleship aspect, I think, as I continue to work with college students, this probably a little over a month ago, our Epic movement, Case Western, we brought in Georgie Wu from California, and she spoke to our Epic students. And just even as we continue to normalize the conversation and even continue to begin the conversation, and just something our students was really asking for and looking for. And it was a very eye-opening, but even a very beginning conversation as we had people from other campuses come to it as well. And so that's something our students are still trying to engage in.
And Hung, Georgie is a licensed marriage and family therapist who was actually a former intern with us as well. So just want to make sure people knew who Georgie was. Shout out to Georgie.
Yay, Georgie. Yeah. Dr. Pongfo, I was thinking of a conversation you and I had recently about discipleship. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as you've been in the community too, discipling and mentoring among American second gen.
Yeah, I think part of how our church came to be was that we saw so many second gen Hmong leave the church because they were dealing with such complex issues in their lives that their parents and the first gen churches could not address because of cultural barriers, whether it's that they couldn't talk about sexuality or they couldn't talk about new ideas. Even new ideas were threatening. So working with second gen Hmong has taught us that healing has to start where they are today. Like we can teach them the Bible back and forth, but if it doesn't impact their relationships with each other and their parents, they're still hurting. And they might be able to spout the right theology or the right Bible verses, but it hasn't transformed their lives. So much of what we do is caring for the whole person. And most of our sermons are talking about how does this apply to your relationship with your parents? Because you think there's such a huge generation gap. But the gospel is a reconciles us to each other. So
Mhm.
we are in the
Amen.
business of not just preaching the gospel, but preaching in the way that transforms the current generation. And that has really been our focus, that discipleship is holistic, like we've been saying here tonight. And if we don't care about somebody's mental health or their relational health or the way they see themselves, that's actually the areas that Satan, the enemy, will enter into their everyday life and
Mhm.
take away any of the theological learning. Like, they know they're supposed to trust God. But how do I trust God when I've bought into the lie that I can control my destiny? You know, how do I forgive someone when my culture tells me that you will lose face if you don't take revenge? So,
Wow.
I mean, it's at that very practical level where mental health and spiritual health and physical health come together.
Wow. I could be talking about this with you guys for hours and hours on end, because this has just been near and dear to my heart in terms of what I've gone through personally, just experiencing deep pain, but also deep redemption because of what God has done. As I just entered into my own story of my own family, my wife's family. And, when you get married, everything is fine, right? It's everything is perfect. None of that stuff leaks out ever, right? Well, for those of us who are walking into this as lay people, what do you guys see are some tools and resources that we can help with discipling other people, get a good baseline for mental health, and also for Dr. Pongfo, how do you know when it's appropriate to get a professional involved as well? I'd love to hear from you, everybody, about what you guys see are some tools and resources. But yeah, how do we get people into professional help?
So when I meet with somebody, whether it's in a mentoring situation or actually in counseling itself, it is important that I, just echoing what Hung said earlier, you have to listen to their story, because different people learn differently. So for someone who's very cognitive, I will choose cognitive approaches. I will give them lots of books to read. As you can see, I have lots of books. But for someone who doesn't like to read, we have to take a different approach. So in our discipleship of others, we really need to meet them at the individual level and learn how they hear best or learn best. There's a reason why God says we need to love with all our heart, soul, mind, strength, because some of us are stronger in one than the other.
Mm.
And so a good mentor, a good friend will meet the friend where they are instead of trying to mold them into the way that I get healing or I see God. So that's really important. Just very basically, you need to know the other person really well before you can be useful to them and helpful to them. That would be the first thing I would say, as far as it's not a resource, but it's a place to start. Before you even give them resources, know what will work well for them.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. What would you guys say is tools and resources that we in Epic or in Crew can actually provide for people on some level? Hung, why don't you get us started if you have any thoughts?
One, I think, something to maybe help them would be, is there a counseling place on the campus for them to go to? And just even what I have done is just even, what does the counseling center offer on the campus? Just for them to know that they have a place that they can go to on campus.
Absolutely.
I think some of the tools, it sounds really basic, is really teaching people about emotions in discipleship. But also, I think what we found in Epic, and as I interact with Asian Americans, is there's a real tie-in to, I believe, our emotional or mental health with our relationship with how we deal with grief and disappointment and loss. And I think teaching people to deal with it from a holistic biblical perspective on that is really important in terms of how, because then all the disappointments and emotions will surface up. And so a lot of times we have resources, we can put some out that we may give to students about loss. And especially during COVID, I would say there's a great resource called Talking About How to Deal with Ambiguous Loss. And ambiguous loss, Dr. Pongfo can tell that better than me, but the idea that it's a loss that is so ambiguous. Like, for example, when are we gonna end this, pandemic? There's a loss, but it's an ongoing loss. We don't even know when. And it just keeps on, we don't know when. And so there's something about that kind of loss that's actually even harder for us emotionally and spiritually. And how do we deal with that? So that's a resource that I want to encourage you to look into. We'll put it in the chat and stuff. So, but there's some other things, but I think teaching our students about emotions and loss, and then even looking what the Bible says about that. How does Jesus deal with our loss and disappointments? Mm-hmm. How did he deal with it? He's a man of sorrow. Kind of like what you said, Tony, we're not comfortable with certain emotions, anger or sadness and sorrow and suffering. And how does Jesus deal with that, as the man of sorrow, And so I think incorporating even Bible narratives and scenarios that talk about emotions, like Elijah was really depressed. The man was depressed. If you look at 1 King, he had done great things. God had done great things. And then he's just so depressed that all he wants to do is sleep and he wants to die. And so just even dealing with that from a biblical perspective, learning from other Bible characters and people. So.
Yeah, thank you.
And Tony, you asked the question of how do we know as we're talking with someone if they need professional help? And I would say it's really important to know the person, because mental health usually affects their functioning to the point that it impairs how they function on a daily basis. And if you don't know where they start, then you won't notice when it's gotten worse. Because some people, when they're depressed, they eat a lot. Others will stop eating, but you don't know that unless you have some idea of the person's baseline. And when the symptoms have gotten worse, or when there are more and more symptoms that are showing up, or the impairment on their daily functioning is getting worse, that's when you would say, okay, I can't just meet up with you and we talk about it and then I support you. You'd really need help. It's gotten worse.
Yeah.
And usually when I've walked with people, by the time we get there, they usually know it too. But it's helpful to know when it's gotten worse.
Right. Well, I appreciate that as a rubric to look through. Are there normal functioning they can't normally function anymore? Because that's a gigantic sign that this is something that needs professional help in a lot of ways too. I think we're also going to be flashing up, for those of you who are watching this, and you might be watching this from a really bad place, we're going to be flashing up a crisis hotline as well, especially for those who are struggling with thoughts about suicide or suicide ideation, things of that nature too. We want to make sure that there are resources for you, that if you are having ideation or thoughts, that you can call this line as soon as possible, to be able to get some help in not doing it alone, and to actually engage with someone, to let them know that you might feel like you're in trouble. So we want to make sure that you have those types of resources available. And Dr. Pongfo, please share with us what you're doing right now with your practice and what you're involved with as well. So please share with us what the Lord's using you in this time.
Yeah. So I have a private practice where I see individuals, couples, families. And what I've been seeing, particularly in the last 5 years, is lots of second gen coming in to work through identity issues. Questions such as, how do I make my own decisions, even while I'm still living at home with my parents? And they can be in their mid-20s to mid-30s, but they experience this pull between being more Western and independent, but also honoring their parents and staying at home with them.
Yeah.
So I often tell them that it's a fine line that they walk, but it's it's an okay choice, because sometimes they feel like they have to choose one or the other. And the reality is bicultural people can't choose. We sometimes don't have the luxury of choosing, I'm going to be really Western now and I'm going to be Hmong now. It's a complex issue, and I'm a complex person. And the reality is I want both. I don't want one or the other. And so I always affirm that it's a worthy decision to straddle the two worlds, for second and third gen, fourth gen, who are like, I'm very Chinese, but I'm also very independent Western. And so issues like that have been coming up a lot for individuals. And then I see primarily couples, and their work is usually around how do we deal with our in-laws who are much more traditional than either of us? How do we navigate being true to our culture, but also having the freedoms to kind of self-express as well as become the fullest person that we believe God has made us to be? So those are real deep issues of identity.
Well, yeah, that is something that is so worthy, and that I know that's been a part of my journey as well. But thank you so much, Dr. Pongfo, for joining us, as well as Margaret, and for Hung. Just your perspectives from each of your different lenses has been so helpful. And I think we all agree that discipling with a holistic mindset, not just looking at the purely spiritual components of a person, that's what our discipleship needs to go into. And I think that's what we really want to highlight, is that, you know, it's not just about becoming a spiritual person. It is very much that God sees us as whole people, and we need to be able to minister to those whole people in this way. Before we finish, we're going to take one or two questions from you who have been casting in some of this. So let's go into some of those questions here as we posted them into the chat. One of the questions I see is, should I go only to Christian counselors, and what about secular counseling?
I'll tackle that. I was trained at Fuller Theological Seminary back there in California. And we talked a lot about what does it mean to integrate psychology and Christianity, or theology. And I would say that my first priority for someone who is struggling with mental health is to get help. So it doesn't matter who you see, get the help. Once you're stabilized, then maybe you'll have time to look around and say, okay, I would actually prefer to see someone who can also bring in the spiritual, biblical counsel that I need. So it's kind of a two-tiered for me. Get the help first. Yeah. And then if you're like, this isn't helping me with the spiritual component, and I can't just see my pastor to get that help, then go ahead and find a Christian counselor.
Yeah, I mean, I think studies have shown that people who have mental health struggles, the first persons they go to are actually the clergy. You know, that's one of the things that we don't always recognize. But then, as I talk to pastors, and I've been pastorally trained in my education, we don't know how to deal with that. You know, that's the thing. It's like we don't know how to deal with that. But any kind of counseling, I think, can at least get you into the door, and then we can start to talk about some of those other topics afterwards, including biblical counseling. I know that becomes another topic within integration with psychology or otherwise. You know, and this leads into the next question that I'm seeing from our gallery. You know, what if my pastor is telling me mental health is not real, or I need to have more faith? You know, how should I respond to that?
Yeah, so we talked earlier about how we are holistic beings, and we trust God with everything. And yet there are components of our being that our pastor, our family, our medical doctor, they don't have the expertise. So if you are struggling with a mental health issue, you would want to see somebody who can help you with those mental health issues. God has given us specific knowledge of himself, but there's also general knowledge that he's given to scientists and other experts. And I would just encourage us to have more of an openness to all the help that can come. So definitely get the spiritual help from your spiritual leader and guide, but get the mental health from somebody who was trained in that area. it takes faith to trust somebody with your life story. So getting help, mental health help it's a step of faith that you're taking.
Yeah, absolutely. Margaret or Hung, I didn't know if you wanted to answer that as well. Because that comes up, I'm afraid, with some of our college students.
It's real. Yeah, I really love what Dr. Pongfo said. I think it's real.
I mean, I think that it's hard when we're talking to people who are our leaders too, right? That there's this like, oh my gosh, there's a stigma of even, can we challenge what our leaders are thinking about this if we don't necessarily agree with that? But I think, Dr. Pongfo, you're right, that we're holistic beings and that it isn't always just about, purely one single way to look at it. It's got to be a holistic understanding. Okay, we have maybe time for one last question from the gallery. If I want to go to counseling, but it is expensive and I'm a bit sheepish and I don't want to ask for money, do you have any suggestions?
I think one of the things that I encourage students to do sometimes is that they're on campus, and right now because of COVID, it might be harder, but even in general, there are some Christian centers, counseling centers that offer what I call support groups, or even churches sometimes offer Celebrate Recovery and different things to help you with grief and loss. Like recently, I lost my best friend this summer, and so I invested in spending 8 weeks with a small group of people going through a grief recovery process. And it was really helpful. It was a lot cheaper, I'll be honest, than if I saw a therapist myself. It would be like 3 times more expensive. Right. So it's 3 times less. And so I would say that's actually sometimes helpful, especially when you see others who can relate to your situation. And it will encourage you to do some deeper work outside of the group as well.
Yeah, that's great.
Many places, many cities will actually have free walk-in counseling. You have a limited number of sessions that are free, and then usually they will refer you somewhere else. So if you don't have funds, there are actually programs here in the Twin Cities. There's a Pathways program that for low-income people to get counseling. Many therapists will do pro bono work. So I might have a caseload of 20, but 2 of those will be free as part of my pro bono work, the ethics of the profession. So don't be afraid to ask around for what is available in your community. Sometimes if you share it with your community of believers, they might say, we're going to pool money together and we will pay for 10 sessions because we believe this is really important. So I would just say, be courageous and let people know that you have a need.
That's a great thought. I mean, a big part of this is, thanks to what you're sharing, is it's a chance for us to really take a step of faith in a new way, to be able to say, yeah, Lord, this is a problem, or I'm having trouble, and that's okay. And we want to be able to say, that's a really important step for all of us as believers to do that, secular or not. I mean, that takes almost a God level sized courage to be able to engage that well. So I'm a big proponent also of Celebrate Recovery groups. You can locate them online as well. So these are different things that a lot of people just don't necessarily know about that would be there. We have about, just to wrap up this whole time, I've really, I can't express enough about how good this has been to engage with these topics. And I'm just grateful for each of you as you've entered in. Do you guys have any last words that you'd want to encourage our audience as we're entering into, again, kind of the next phase of our holiday season, as we're entering into some, I was just noticing it gets dark really fast now. And during COVID, it's significantly more pronounced than ever before. You guys have any last words of encouragement for our audience?
Yeah, I would just say that I would encourage people to go back and read the stories of Jesus' encounter with people when he was healing them, because we see the physical healing, but Jesus always did an emotional healing as well. So whether it was touching the lepers or whether it was sitting there and listening to the woman talk about her history with bleeding, like there was such an emotional healing that took place with the physical healing, and I want people to be encouraged by that. We seem to be able to go up and ask prayer for physical healing, but not for emotional healing. And so I would encourage us just to see ourselves in the stories of Jesus healing.
That's great. That's really good. Margaret or Hung, do you have any last encouragements?
Just understand that the things that you're going through, that you're not alone. I think sometimes those are the lies that we play in our head, that I'm the only one that's going through some of this. Is, man, God created community. God created us to be in community. And so just remembering, and take one trusted friend that you trust, and, hey, can you pray for me? I have some things that are going on. And so
I think my last words would be 2 Corinthians 1:3-5, that even as we invest in holistically growing, that to know that God, the same God who comforts me with the comfort that he gives me, is the same God that could actually use me to comfort others. And I really do see that as I allow the gospel to infiltrate every part of my being, whether it's emotional, physical, and spiritual, that I actually become a better vessel for the gospel, that I can actually help other people come to know Jesus in a different way, that it could relate to them. Like, oh yeah, I deal with depression. I deal with that. Or I have friends who dealt with that. Can you tell me more about that? That is such a bridge to loving people and people who really are really despairing at times. And so I really see that we have the hope of us being healed, but also we get to be a part of that healing. We bring them to Jesus. And so.
Amen. Amen. That's a great way to end this this broadcast. Dr. Pongfo, thank you so much for joining us as someone who's been outside of the Epic circles. Margaret, of course, we always loving you being here with us. And then Hung, thank you so much for your insights as we hear from you and what's going on and with our college students today. Tune in next month. We're going to be doing our next broadcast at the beginning of January, first Thursday of January. We're going to be going into some of the bread and butter of what we do in the Epic movement. We're going to be talking about discipleship and evangelism. I'm really stoked about that because we don't always see what's the difference actually between discipleship and evangelism. There's something in there. So we want to discuss that with you. We want to be able to share that with you. We want you to love what God's doing in this world today. So we are prayerful that you find good mental health in this coming season, especially as we have Christmas coming up, as we have the remembrance of Jesus coming incarnationally, that he incarnationally came for you and for us to be whole and be the people that God made us to be. So my prayer for all of you as our audience and for what we're going into as Christmas, that this season you can indeed be the person that God made you to be. Merry Christmas. Take care, everybody.